It was just over 90 minutes beyond President Bush's deadline for Saddam Hussein to leave Iraq that U.S. warships and planes, there were F-117 stealth bombers involved, launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The attack came in waves, cruise missiles followed by the F-117 stealth bombers with so-called bunker-busting bombs. Their target, a bunker believed to be sheltering what are called top leaders of the Iraqi regime. Now, this is what it looked and sounded like in Baghdad. It was this short, and this is what happened.
But the exciting financial opportunities of this human catastrophe don't have to wait for the war to actually end. The government has already begun handing out contracts to corporations to clean up and rebuild the country we haven't finished bombing yet. Yesterday, for instance, the Army awarded a multi-million-dollar contract to pay for extinguishing oil fires and repairing oil infrastructure. Who got it? Well, let's see. Let's hear the drum roll, please. Note to self, new drummer. And the winner of the first oil services contract in Iraq goes to Halliburton! Wait a minute, Halliburton, that name rings a bell. Oh, I know. Until 2000, its CEO was Dick Cheney. Yes. Cheney, that name rings a bell. Oh, I know. He's the vice president. Well, on the bright side, I won my office pool. But on the other hand, hearing that does make me feel like the government just on my chest. Now, by the way, for those of you at home who might have missed that, I said... Of course, Halliburton has refused to divulge the monetary value of that contract, though according to a spokesman, quote, we're going to do all right on this one.
If I put my tinfoil hat on when I talk about these interventionist foreign policy wars and regime change wars, the tinfoil hat thinks military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
People being asked or forced into making decisions that benefit these giant corporations that make weapons and profit off of war.
Yeah.
This is the worst case scenario in terms of conspiracy theories. The idea that someone wants war so that they can make money and they don't care if people die, even needlessly. This is our number one conspiracy fear, right? If you had to think about of all the things that you hope are not true about the way the world works, that would probably be number one.
Well, you can take your tinfoil hat off because the military-industrial complex is a real thing.
Recently unearthed footage of Rand Paul from 2009. It's pretty exciting. So here's Rand Paul in 2009 speaking to Republican students at Western Kentucky University, and he's talking about Dick Cheney and the war in Iraq, and listen to his theory.
There's a great YouTube of Dick Cheney in 1995 defending Bush #1, and he goes on for about 5 minutes. He's being interviewed, I think, by the American Enterprise Institute, and he says it would be a disaster, it would be vastly expensive, it would be a civil war, we'd have no exit strategy. He goes on and on for 5 minutes. Dick Cheney said it would be a bad idea, and that's why the first Bush didn't go into Baghdad.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq, the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq.
Dick Cheney then goes to work for Halliburton, makes hundreds of millions of dollars as CEO. Next thing you know, he's back in government. It's a good idea to go into Iraq. The day after 9/11, George Tenet's going in the House and Richard Pearl's coming out of the White House. And George Tenet should know more about intelligence than anybody in the world. And the first thing Richard Pearl says to him on the way out is, we've got it, now we can go into Iraq. And George Tenet, who supposedly knows as much intelligence as anybody in the White House, says, Well, don't we need to know that they have some connection to 9/11? He says it doesn't matter. It became an excuse. 9/11 became an excuse for a war that they already wanted in Iraq.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
I'm Ray McGovern, a 27-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. Why did you lie to get us into a war that was not necessary and that has caused these kinds of casualties?
Ruh-roh. First of all, I haven't lied.
Oh, he didn't lie. All right, well, that settles it, everybody. There's pound cake in the back. We can all have a nice time. And
It appears that there were not weapons of mass destruction there.
You said you knew where they were.
I did not.
See? He never said he knew where they were.
We know where they are. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad and east, west, south, and north somewhat.
So the Secretary of Defense caught in a contradiction about weapons of mass destruction. Surely that will be a big story.
How much of an axe do you have to grind with Secretary Rumsfeld?
But he wasn't just any heckler. Were you nervous?
Tucker, I resent the word heckler. I'd like you to take that back.
Okay, I'm not taking it back.
Donald Rumsfeld encouraged whoever, I think, had their hands on you at the time to let you stay there. Does he get any credit for that today?
Isn't it enough that he was wrong and had bad judgment? Why does he have to be a liar, too?
Well, you know, that's the question you have to direct to him.
But won't.
Right after 9/11, people were asked about Iraq, and only about 16% felt Saddam Hussein had anything to do with it. But with all of this propaganda coming out, Cheney and all those folks, about 28% believed that Iraq had something to do with it. 2 years after we invaded Iraq, close to 60%, 56% of Americans believed a delusion.
What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing.
Wait, in a press conference right after September 11th, President Bush was asked, what did Iraq have to do with September 11th? And he said nothing. President Bush must watch Alex Jones, I guess, because 2 years later, after all the run-up to the war in Iraq, the media and the propaganda machine had convinced 56% of the American people that Iraq had something to do with September 11th. Is this proof that propaganda works and the CIA can control some elements of our media? I would suggest this is pretty good evidence that might be the case. What hurdles are you encountering that you didn't expect?
You know, a lot of what's happening are things that we kind of did expect. You know, the smear campaigns, the misinformation campaigns.
Now we're doing a phony war again. There's a false flag in Syria. Why are we in Syria? Nobody tells you. We're there because we want to help people. While we're killing kids in in Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, no matter where they are, we'll kill them. We want a torture facility in Cuba, but we're in Syria because we care about people. We're in Syria because there's a pipeline they want to put through it. That's why we're there. And Tulsi Gabbard comes on TV to talk about it in a real way, like, hey, let's have peace because this is crazy. We did this in Iraq. Look how it turned out. We did this in Afghanistan. Look how it turned out. We're doing this in Libya. We did it in Libya. Look how it turned out. We want to do it again in Syria. Let's not do this. What are you going to replace Assad with? And why do you want to overthrow him in the first place? Why are we teaming up with ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria? These are all talk about on the news. The news won't tell you that it's ISIS and Al-Qaeda we're working with to overthrow Assad. Yeah, we're training them and arming them. ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I bet that works out great. So when we get rid of Assad, who are we going to replace him with? ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So here's Tulsi Gabbard come on and say, hey, this is all crazy. Listen to what she says.
An investigation for these horrific chemical weapons attacks. I'll be the first one
to denounce him. But the key is now with President Trump's reckless military strikes last night, it flew directly in the face of the action that the UN was working on at that time to launch an independent investigation, to find out exactly what the facts are, who was involved and who was responsible.
So that seems pretty sober. That seems like, oh, thank God a grown-up came into the room and she said, hey, let the UN do their investigation. Let's find out what the facts are before we, I don't know, start a war. Maybe we find out what the facts are before we launch Tomahawk cruise missiles into someone else's country and maybe start World War III. Maybe we do that. We wait for the UN to investigate. Sounds pretty, doesn't that sound rational to you guys?
Sounds perfectly rational.
That sounds rational. You have a master's degree. You're a teacher. That sounds rational.
Sounds sensible, certainly.
You're a business owner, Dave.
It makes sense.
Sounds.
Even though shooting first and asking later has always worked out swimmingly for the United States, I feel like this time, yeah, I'm with that too.
So she's saying exactly what Ron said. Let's not shoot and ask questions later like we did in Iraq and Libya. Let's wait. Let's wait. Let's get the... You know, remember like in 2013 when there was a false flag gas attack back then that was proven to be a false flag? So thank God we have a congresswoman like that doing that. Here's the thanks you get for doing that, for calling for sober investigations and not rushing to war. Here's the thanks you get from that. Now, these aren't right-wing maniacs. Here's your left-wing warmongers.
That is Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. She's an Iraq vet and member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and she's casting doubt on the president's claim that the Syrian government was indeed behind the chemical attack that killed as many as 100 people last Tuesday. Let's bring in Howard Dean, former Vermont governor, former DNC chair. And Howard, how do you respond to Tulsi Gabbard?
I think it's outrageous. There's a long, well-known history, both in our Intelligence Committee, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders. Every single one of these agencies has said that Assad is using chemical weapons.
So then, yeah, I guess you would be for an investigation because you'll know how it's going to turn out. The investigation will prove that it's definitely him, and then we get to live by our standards of having an investigation before we invade another country. Remember how we did in Iraq? We were all sure. Everybody was sure. There could be no doubt. We were all sure. And by the way, this is a guy who was an anti-war candidate, ran against the Iraq War. He used to say he's from the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And here he is, couldn't be beating the war for drums more and more irresponsible. Is there a bigger menace to the country than someone who beats the war for drum and shames someone who calls for an investigation before we bomb someone? So this is war propaganda at the top of their lungs at 1,000 miles an hour. This is war propaganda from a guy who used to be the head of the Democratic Party and now given a free seat on mainstream news media because he's willing to say this all day long and wag his finger at a veteran. A veteran. Tulsi Gabbard is a veteran who's calling for peace, and this piece of garbage, Howard Dean, and he is sitting there going to shame her. Let's listen to some more.
Some might call Howard Dean a draft dodger, too, FYI.
Is he? Maybe. Why don't you go to war, Howard? Howard, when did you go fight in a war? Did you ever do that? Maybe you should shut up then, you warmonger.
Imagine how you could make a statement like that, especially being on the Foreign Relations Committee.
He said, I can't imagine how you can make a statement like that, telling the truth in front of our war propaganda machine. Why would you do that? You know you're going to be ostracized. You know we're going to do to you what we did to Ralph Nader.
Maybe you can make a statement like that because you have an understanding of foreign relations. He answered that question in his own statement. I don't know how you make a statement like that in foreign relations. Maybe because you understand how it works. Maybe because you know how to do your job.
And it's not like she's saying anything radical. She's not saying, make Assad Mr. America. All she's saying is let's look at what actually happened before we blow up.
She's calling for an investigation, and he's making that sound like she's crazy.
What do you want facts for?
Calls for an investigation, and they're the mainstream media. She's crazy.
Do you think that someone's doing this on purpose, or do you think this is team mentality in action, where people are supporting a particular candidate and they look at you as being competition of that candidate? Like, what do you think?
I think it's probably a combination. I'm challenging the establishment, challenging the status quo, challenging the foreign policy establishment, and challenging the political establishment in calling things as I see them, calling it straight, and speaking the truth, whether that be calling out leaders within my own party or leaders of the other political party. And, I think that strikes fear in a lot of people who are uncomfortable with it at a minimum and who are concerned because when, we the people rise up and say, hey, what's really going on here? We're calling out self-serving politicians in Washington from both political parties who are putting their own political interests or the interests of their party ahead of the interests of the people. Or they're putting the interests of, whatever greedy corporation and their lobbyist is writing the biggest checks to their campaigns ahead of the interests of the people. So the more this awareness comes out, the more people stand up and speak out and say, hey, this is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. Then it's threatening that very power base that they have thrived and lived off of for far too long.
Put my tinfoil hat on when I talk about these interventionist foreign policy wars and regime change wars. The tinfoil hat thinks military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
People being asked or forced into making decisions that benefit these giant corporations that make weapons and profit off of war.
Yeah.
This is the worst case scenario in terms of conspiracy theories. The idea that someone wants war so that they can make money and they don't care if people die, even needlessly. This is our number one conspiracy fear, right? If you had to think about, of all the things that you hope are not true about the way the world works, that would probably be number one.
Well, you can take your tinfoil hat off because the military-industrial complex is a real thing.
For more on this, we turn now to our senior correspondent, Mr. Stephen Colbert. Stephen joins us from the White House. Today, Stephen, the Bush administration awarded Halliburton a contract for post-war construction of oil wells. The company isn't even disclosing how much the contract is worth. What do you make of this arrangement?
John, keeping in mind that Halliburton is a major contributor to the Republican campaign and that Vice President Cheney is its former CEO, this move by the government is extremely...
Halliburton Corporation, which got these defense contracts in the 2003 Iraq War, they have a long history of being a military defense contractor that has profited from U.S. wars. This is from an article in counterpunchmagazine.com, which is, I believe, based on a New York Times article. And here it says, the biggest project by far during the Vietnam War was a $220 million contract to build a mammoth Air Force base in Vietnam. In 1967, the General Accounting Office estimated that they could not account for the whereabouts of over $120 million worth of material that had been shipped to Vietnam as part of Halliburton's construction efforts. Later, 1973, Halliburton won a $120 million contract to build Iraq's two mammoth oil terminals in the Persian Gulf. There was a war that broke out between Iran and Iraq in the early 1980s. That war was supported by the USA CIA. We helped arm Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis in their war with Iran. And one person who benefited from that was none other than the Halliburton Corporation that was called in to repair the war damage.
Extremely...
Stephen?
Hold on a second, John. You know, I'm a bit of a stickler for language, and I've been trying all day to think of what exactly the right word for this would be.
Well, Stephen, maybe I can help you out. Can you describe what you're going for?
Okay, let's see. If this word were a flavor, it would be a thick brown taste in the back of your throat, an acrid tang of decay, like you're rotting from the inside.
Unpleasant.
Yeah, that's getting there.
Nauseating.
It's tough. You know, I've been thinking about this all day. I've been poring over my thesaurus, and so far, nothing quite captures the feeling. I've tried appalling, shameful, reprehensible.
Later, in 1995, Halliburton got a $550 million contract to provide logistical support for U.S. forces in Bosnia, Croatia, and Hungary. and Halliburton got another $6.3 million contract to support our Air Force base in Italy. There was a war in Yugoslavia between Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, and Halliburton profited from that greatly. One way they profited from that was they were buying plywood for $14 a sheet, and they were rebuilding schools and hospitals with that plywood and charging the U.S. government $85 per sheet. One former employee says that the Halliburton employees inflated costs at over 224 projects in Kosovo.
Now, President Trump campaigned against regime change wars when he ran for president, but now he bows to the wishes of the neocons who surround him, clamoring for regime change wars that he claimed to oppose, this time in Venezuela and in Iran. These powerful politicians dishonor the sacrifices made by every one of my brothers and sisters in uniform, their families, as they are the ones who pay the price for these wars. In fact, every American pays the price for these wars that have cost us trillions of dollars since 9/11. Every dollar that we spend on regime change wars or on the new Cold War and this nuclear arms race is a dollar coming out of our pockets. Dollars that should be used to address the very real urgent needs of our people and our communities right here at home.
The big daddy of them all came during the Iraq War of 2003-4. Halliburton got a contract for feeding the soldiers at a particular Air Force base, or Army base, excuse me. They billed the government for feeding 4,700 soldiers a day, and they charged the U.S. government $240 million. Later, it turned out they had inflated the bill by over 200% because it was proven via paperwork they had never served more than 2,500 soldiers in any single day. The corruption of this Halliburton group is just unbelievable. And again, Dick Cheney, vice president under George Bush, George H.W. Bush's father, and Prescott Bush's grandfather are all linked to this Halliburton company. One of the biggest outrages in 2004, a Kuwaiti company called Altamia was charging Halliburton $2.65 per gallon, roughly 3 times the rate that the Iraqi oil ministry was charging for diesel fuel and gasoline in the country, and Halliburton was selling that to our U.S. military.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.